Tell me all of this is real, Elena. She was just a waitress at a hotel. She had this way of looking at me like I was just a man, not a boss. For the first time in my life, I'm letting someone in. These nights be real. Her touch, the way she whispered my name in the dark, it makes me feel alive. I've lived in the shadows for so long, I forgot what the sun felt like. He closes his eyes, a small, genuine smile tugging at his lips. I think I've finally found my soulmate, and for her. I'd give it all up. Spent my whole life making sure no one could get close enough to hurt me. In my world, you don't survive by being soft. I was the man everyone feared. I never broke. I never begged. I'm untouchable. The Grand Hotel was a tomb of marble and silence at 2 a.m. Enzo sat in the VIP of the bar. He had just come from a meeting that required him to be a monster, and the adrenaline was finally curdling into a heavy, aching exhaustion. He stared at the amber liquid in his glass, not drinking, just waiting for the world to stop spinning. He didn't hear her approach. In his world, if you didn't hear someone coming, you were usually dead. But she didn't move like an assassin or a socialite looking for a favor. She moved like someone who was simply tired of standing. Subscribe to this channel as we continue with this story. A glass of ice water and a small plate of plain crackers appeared on the polished wood next to his scotch. "Ga'awa," Enzo said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He didn't look up. He didn't want to see another person who wanted something from him. "Oatst," a soft voice replied, "but my shift ends in 10 minutes and I've watched you stare at that same ice cube for an hour. You look like you've been fighting ghosts all day, and ghosts don't go away on an empty stomach." Enzo finally lifted his gaze. He expected to see a flirtatious smile or a trembling girl terrified of his reputation. Instead, he saw a waitress in a cheap, slightly too big white shirt. Her name tag said Elena. Her hair was slipping out of its clip, and there were faint circles under her eyes that matched his own. She wasn't looking at the bus of the city. She was looking at a man who looked like he was drowning. "On the hus," she whispered, sliding the water closer. "Water and silence. That's usually what people like you need most." She didn't wait for a thank you. She walked back to the bar and started wiping down the counter, her movements steady and rhythmic. Enzo watched her. He was a man who lived behind bulletproof glass and iron doors, yet this girl had walked right past his guard with nothing but a glass of water. He took a sip. The coldness cleared the smoke from his lungs. He found himself watching the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't performing. For the first time in years, Enzo felt the crushing weight on his chest loosen just a fraction. 10 minutes later, he saw her grab a thin jacket and head toward the service exit. Without thinking, Enzo stood up and followed. He found her in the narrow alleyway behind the hotel, leaning against the damp brick wall, looking up at the small patch of stars visible between the skyscrapers. "Water Hulpud," he said, stepping into the dim yellow light of the exit lamp. Elena didn't jump. She just turned her head and gave him a small, weary smile. "Good." Most people in this hotel think money is the only thing that fixes a bad day. They're usually wrong. They stood there in the cold night air, the sounds of the city muffled by the brick walls. Enzo didn't ask her name, and she didn't ask his. He just stood there with her, letting the silence settle between them. For a few minutes, he wasn't the man who controlled the docks or the streets. He was just a man in an alleyway, standing next to a girl who smelled like vanilla and hard work. He was already addicted to the peace she brought him. He didn't know it yet, but the fortress he had built around his heart had just developed its first crack. The alleyway behind the Grand Hotel became Enzo's cathedral. It was a narrow, damp strip of concrete tucked away from the flashing neon of the city, smelling of industrial detergent and old bricks. Every night at 2 a.m, the heavy steel service door would groan open, and Elena would step out into the cold air. Enzo was always there, leaning against his black sedan, waiting in the shadows. He had bodyguards stationed at the ends of the block, men with guns and cold eyes, but in this small space, he tried to forget they existed. He began to live for these 15-minute breaks. They were the only moments in his 24-hour day where he wasn't deciding who lived or who stayed in debt. "Buck," Elena said one Tuesday, her voice a soft hum against the distant sound of sirens. She sat on a discarded plastic crate, smoothing out her apron. "Don't you have a home, Enzo? Or at least a hobby that doesn't involve lurking in Allahs?" "Thus is the only place where no one is asking me for a fava," Ha replied, stepping into the dim yellow light of the overhead lamp. He handed her a paper cup of coffee he'd picked up from a 24-hour diner blocks away, not the expensive brew from his penthouse, but something simple and hot. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a jolt through him that felt more electric than any power play he'd made in a boardroom. She started talking about her day, the rude customers, a broken coffee machine, and how she was saving up for a new pair of shoes because her soles were wearing thin. He listened with an intensity that would have terrified his enemies. He found himself fascinated by the mundane details of her life. To him, the fact that she worried about rent or a blister on her heel was beautiful. It was real. Envy ya," Ha said quietly, watching a stray cat dart between the shadows. Elena laughed, a light, genuine sound that made his heart ache. "You envy a waitress who smells like fried onions and dish soap? You're wearing a watch that costs more than my apartment building, Enzo." "Trade the watch for the way you sleep at night," Ha countered. He wasn't exaggerating. The more he sat with her, the more his own life felt like a suit of armor that had grown too small and too heavy. He was addicted to her normal. Ha loved that she didn't know about the blood on his ledger or the names of the men he'd disappeared. With her, he was just a guy who brought her coffee and liked the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was tired. He began to pull away from his duties. He cut meetings short and ignored his phone when it buzzed with urgent messages from his underbosses. His men started to whisper, noticing the change in him. He was becoming distracted, his mind always drifting back to the smell of vanilla and the sound of Elena's voice. One night, as her break ended, she stood up and reached out, straightening the lapel of his coat. "You look less like a ghost tonight," she whispered. He caught her hand, holding it against his chest for a heartbeat longer than necessary. He could feel his own heart thudding against his ribs, fast and erratic. He was a man who owned half the city, but in that moment, he realized he didn't want the city anymore. He just wanted to stay in this alleyway forever. The elevator rose in a silence that felt different than the quiet of the alleyway. It was a smooth, expensive ascent that stripped away the smell of the city and replaced it with the scent of polished wood and cold air conditioning. Elena stood beside Enzo, her small canvas bag clutched in her hands, looking out at the skyline as it dropped away beneath them. When the doors slid open directly into the penthouse, the space was vast and intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling glass showed a city that looked like a collection of jewels, but inside, the apartment was a fortress of leather, stone, and shadows. There were no family photos on the walls, no clutter on the counters. It was a place built for a man who expected to be attacked, not a man who expected to be loved. "It's beautiful," Elena whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. She walked toward the window, her footsteps muffled by the thick rugs. "But it feels like a museum. Does anyone actually live here?" Enzo watched her move, his heart hammering in a way it never did during a high-stakes deal. Bringing her here felt more dangerous than any street war. This was his inner sanctum, the place where he took off the literal and figurative armor. By letting her cross this threshold, he was handing her the keys to his life. "I sleep here," Enzo said, walking over to stand behind her. "I don't think I've ever really lived here." He reached out, his hands hovering over her shoulders before finally settling there. He felt her relax into his touch, her head tilting back to rest against his chest. Through the glass, the world looked small and manageable. For the first time, the power he held over the city didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something he could finally put down because she was there to help him carry the weight of himself. He led her to the kitchen, a space of stainless steel and marble that had likely never seen a homemade meal. He watched as she explored the space, her fingers trailing over the surfaces. She looked so out of place in her simple clothes against the backdrop of his wealth, yet she was the only thing in the room that felt right. "Feel like I am in a movie," she said with a small, shy laugh, turning to face him. "Is this really your life, Enzo? All this steel and glass?" "It was," he replied, stepping closer until the heat from her body reached him. "But it's just a house. It's been empty for a long time." He took her bag from her hand and set it on the counter, then took both of her hands in his. Her palms were soft, a stark contrast to the calloused skin of his own. He felt a fierce, protective urge rise up in him. He wanted to keep her here, safe from the grime of the hotel and the cold of the alleyway. He wanted to wrap his entire world around her so that she would never have to worry about rent or worn-out shoes again. As he looked into her eyes, he didn't see the reflection of a mafia boss. He saw a man who was finally home. He only knew that for tonight, the lion's den was finally quiet. The penthouse was silent, the only sound the low hum of the city's heart beating 50 floors below. Enzo stood by the glass wall, his dark reflection ghosting over the lights of the skyline. He had spent years in rooms like this, surrounded by expensive things and cold air, but tonight the atmosphere had changed. The air felt thick, charged with a magnetic pull he couldn't fight anymore. Elena was standing a few feet away, her silhouette soft against the sharp edges of his furniture. She had taken off her shoes, her bare feet disappearing into the deep pile of the rug. She looked small in the vastness of his world, yet she was the only thing he could see. "So quiet tonight," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She walked toward him, stopping just close enough that he could smell the faint scent of vanilla and warm skin. Enzo didn't look at the city, he looked at her. "I'm not used to this," he admitted, his voice rough. "The quiet. Having someone here who doesn't want to take something from me." "Don't want anything but you, Enzo," she replied. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it flat against his chest. The touch was like an electric current hitting his skin through the fine silk of his shirt. He let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for a lifetime. He covered her hand with his own, pressing it harder against his ribs so she could feel the frantic, heavy thud of his heart. For a man who lived by his iron will, this loss of control was terrifying, yet it made him feel more alive than he had ever been. He reached for her, his hands sliding up her arms to her shoulders, drawing her into his space. The tension that had been building in the alleyways and the hotel bar finally snapped. He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a question that was answered the moment she tilted her head back to meet him. The kiss was desperate and deep, a collision of two people who had been starving for something real. Enzo's hands moved to her waist, pulling her flush against him, feeling the curves of her body through her thin dress. He wasn't the boss here. He was just a man. He moved his mouth to her neck, his breath hot against her skin, and he felt her arch into him with a soft moan that nearly broke his resolve. He lifted her easily, carrying her to the bedroom where the only light came from the moon reflecting off the river. As he laid her down on the silk sheets, he felt a strange vulnerability. He stripped away his clothes, casting aside the armor of his status until he was just skin and bone, standing before her in the dark. When he finally joined her, the friction of their bodies was like a match to dry wood. He moved with a slow, possessive hunger, his eyes never leaving hers. Every touch, every gasp, and every whispered word felt like a promise. He felt her nails dig into his shoulders, marking him, and he welcomed the sting. In the heat of the moment, as he lost himself in her, the world outside, the blood, the ledgers, the enemies, ceased to exist. For the first time in his life, Enzo wasn't thinking about the next move or the next threat. He was simply there, anchored to the earth by the woman in his arms. He truly believed he had found the one person who could see the man behind the monster and love him anyway. The quiet of the penthouse, once a sanctuary, felt suddenly thin and fragile. Enzo stood in his private study, the morning sun cutting through the blinds in sharp, cold lines. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up, but his mind was far from the warmth of the bed he had just left. He was staring at the digital log on his monitor. It was a minor thing, a login timestamp that was off by 3 minutes, a file path that seemed slightly displaced. But in Enzo's world, a minor thing was a leak, and a leak was a death sentence. He felt a coldness settle in his gut that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. For weeks, he had allowed himself to drift, anchored only by Elena's presence and the peace she brought him. He had been soft. He had been distracted. And now, the reality of his life was clawing its way back through the cracks in his armor. He closed the laptop with a muffled thud and walked out of the room, his face hardening into the mask of the boss that the city feared. He found his security team in the downstairs briefing room. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and nervous sweat. 6 men stood in a line, their heads bowed, their hands clasped behind their backs. These were men he had trusted for years, men who were paid handsomely to ensure that his fortress remained impenetrable. "Someone was in my study," Enzo said, his voice low and dangerous, like the growl of a predator before the strike. "Boss, the perimeter was never breached," the head of security stammered, his eyes darting to the floor. "The biometric locks showed no unauthorized entry. It must have been a system glitch." Enzo moved with a sudden, violent grace, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him against the cold concrete wall. The sound of the impact echoed through the room. "I don't pay for glitches. I pay for ghosts to stay in the shadows." He didn't want to believe that his sanctuary had been violated. He wanted to believe that the world he shared with Elena was separate from the world of blood and ledgers. But the discrepancy was there, a silent witness to his own carelessness. He felt a surge of self-loathing. He had let his guard down for a woman, and now his empire was showing its first signs of rust. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look for excuses. He dealt with the failure the only way he knew how to maintain order. He ordered the team to be stripped of their rank and sent to the docks for the most grueling, dangerous shifts, a punishment that served as a loud, clear message to the rest of his organization. The violence of the morning left him feeling hollow, the adrenaline leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. When he returned to the penthouse, Elena was in the kitchen making coffee. She looked so small and innocent in the morning light, wearing one of his oversized shirts. She turned and smiled at him, a warm, genuine look that usually made his heart melt. But today, Enzo couldn't return the smile. He looked at her and felt a sudden, sharp pang of fear. He wasn't afraid of his enemies. He was afraid of how much he had to lose. He walked over and held her tightly, burying his face in her neck, trying to drown out the suspicion and the coldness with the scent of her skin. He didn't tell her about the files. He didn't want to stain her with his world. He just held her. The city lights outside the window were a blurred smear of gold and white, but inside the bedroom, the world had narrowed down to the space between them. Enzo stood by the edge of the bed, his chest bare, watching Elena. The tension from the morning's violence at the docks was still humming in his veins, but as she stepped toward him, the hardness in his shoulders began to dissolve. She was wearing the red silk dress, the fabric clinging to her curves like a second skin, glowing in the soft amber light of the bedside lamps. "Still carrying it," she whispered, her voice a soft caress as she reached out and placed her hand over his heart. "The weight of the world. Let it go, Enzo." Just for tonight he felt a desperate, almost primal need to be close to her, to lose himself in the only thing that felt honest in his life. He kissed her for a while, and I suddenly broke off. He didn't allow her to complete her statement. He threw his hands round her waist and drew her close to him. He kissed her like his life depended on it. His hands started moving. Her touch sent electric shock through his body. He unhooked her bra, her fingers brushing his skin so lightly that goosebumps spread all over him. When his mouth closed around one of her nipples, she gasped, clutching the back of his head. He sucked hungrily, like a starved baby, and the sensation shot straight down to his core. Tonight, he wasn't the man who ordered hits or balanced ledgers. He was just a man starved for affection, and she was the only one who could feed him. She slid down and unbuckled his belt, her hands trembling but eager. She freed him, and when she took him in her mouth, his sharp intake of breath told her she was hitting the right spots. He moaned low, his hand gripping her hair, trying not to lose control. The taste, the weight, the power of it all made her hotter. She was dripping already. He stopped her suddenly, panting, and pulled her back up. "I can't. I need to feel you," he whispered in a strained voice. He pushed her cloth up and slid her underwear aside. The moment her fingers brushed him, he nearly collapsed on her. He was soaked, his body begging. He guided her down onto himself, and the moment he entered, her mouth flew open in a silent scream. The stretch, the fullness, it was overwhelming. She rode him, slow at first, then faster, each thrust making her boobs bounce in his face. He latched onto them greedily, sucking, biting, leaving marks that burned in the sweetest way. His hands squeezed her body, spanking her hard in between. As he moved inside her, the world outside, the missing files, the suspicious guards, the rising threats evaporated completely. Every gasp she let out, every time she arched her back to meet his thrusts, felt like a victory over the darkness he lived in. "You feel so good," he groaned, slamming his hips upward to meet hers. She screamed his name, losing herself completely. The penthouse echoed with their moans, the sound of skin against skin. Her thighs shook, but he didn't stop. She wanted to break him, to burn with him. "Spent my whole life alone," he groaned against her skin, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was untouchable. I thought I was enough on my own. But it was so cold, Elena. You're the first person who ever made me feel warm." He looked into her eyes, seeing his own reflection in the dark pupils. In that moment of absolute vulnerability, with their bodies tangled and their breaths mingling, he felt a connection that transcended physical pleasure. It was a merging of souls, a rare and terrifying honesty that made him want to weep. He believed with every fiber of his being that he had finally found his soulmate. He believed that no matter what happened to his empire, as long as she was in this bed, he was safe. The climax was a shattering release, leaving them both breathless and shaking in the quiet aftermath. Enzo held her tightly, his arms wrapped around her as if he were afraid she might vanish if he let go. He kissed her forehead, his heart full of a peace he had never known. The morning light was cold and gray, cutting through the heavy curtains of the penthouse like a dull blade. Enzo reached out across the silk sheets, his hand instinctively searching for the warmth of Elena's body, but his fingers met only the lingering chill of an empty bed. He stayed still for a moment, his eyes closed, waiting for the sound of the shower or the clinking of a coffee mug in the kitchen. But the silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful quiet they had shared just hours before. It was the hollow, ringing silence of a tomb. He sat up, the sheets sliding off his chest. The space beside him was smooth, the pillow barely indented, as if she had been gone for hours. A strange, sharp anxiety began to claw at his throat, a feeling he hadn't felt since he was a boy hiding in the dark. He stood up, not bothering with a robe, and walked toward the living area. The penthouse was perfect, every expensive ornament in its place, but the air felt thin and stripped of her scent. "Elena," he called out. His voice was low, barely a whisper, but it seemed to shatter against the marble walls. There was no answer. He walked toward the study, his heart beginning to beat in a heavy, uneven rhythm. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, and the first thing he saw was the small, steady pulse of a red light. It was the internal alarm on his floor-mounted safe, a silent scream that the encryption had been bypassed from the inside. Enzo stopped in his tracks. His breath hitched in his chest as he looked at the open steel door. The leather-bound ledger, the digital drives containing the names of every contact, every offshore account, and every life he controlled, they were gone. The space where his empire lived was a dark, empty hole. He didn't roar in anger. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply stood there, his world collapsing in a way that no rival family had ever managed to achieve. He looked down at the desk and saw a small object resting on the wood. It was the gold necklace he had given her just a week ago, the one she said she would never take off. It sat there, coiled like a dead snake, cold and mocking. The realization didn't come in a wave. It came like a slow, freezing tide. Every soft word, every touch in the dark, every time she had looked into his eyes and made him feel like a man instead of a monster, it had all been a performance. The waitress who needed shoes, the girl who liked her coffee with too much sugar, the soulmate who made him feel alive. She was a ghost he had invited in to rob him blind. He slumped into his leather chair, the same chair where he had sat while she rubbed his shoulders just 2 nights ago. His chest felt tight, a physical weight pressing down on his lungs until he could barely breathe. He wasn't thinking about the millions he had lost or the danger he was now in. He was thinking about the way she had kissed him before they fell asleep, and how he had actually thanked God for her. For the first time in his life, the man who never broke felt himself shattering. The betrayal didn't just hurt, it erased the only version of himself he had ever liked. The silence in the study was broken only by the sound of Enzo's heavy, jagged breathing. He didn't turn around when the floorboard creaked behind him. He didn't need to. The air had changed. The warmth that usually followed her into a room was replaced by a sharp, metallic coldness. He stayed slumped in his chair, staring at the empty safe, his hands resting lifelessly on the desk. "I killed 3 of my men yesterday," he said, his voice a low, hollow rasp. "I thought they were the ones who betrayed me." I looked them in the eye and watched them plead for lives they hadn't actually forfeited. All the while, the thief was sleeping in my arms. He finally turned the chair. The woman standing in the doorway wasn't the waitress from the hotel. She wasn't wearing the red silk dress or the oversized shirt he had loved to see her in. Elena was dressed in matte black tactical gear, her hair pulled back into a tight, professional knot. She held a suppressed weapon in one hand and the encrypted drive containing his life's work in the other. Her face was a mask of cold efficiency, but her eyes were red-rimmed, swimming with a moisture she couldn't quite blink away. Enzo stood up slowly. He didn't reach for the gun in his drawer. He didn't call for the guards who were likely already incapacitated. He just walked toward her until the muzzle of her weapon was inches from his chest. He looked at her, and for the first time in his life, the man feared by the entire city looked small. Broken. "The nights we spent talking until the sun came up," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The way you held me when I woke up screaming from the nightmares, the way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching. Was any of it real, Elena?" He took another step, pressing his chest against the cold metal of her gun. He didn't care if she pulled the trigger. In fact, he almost hoped she would. The pain in his chest was so heavy, so physical, that a bullet felt like it would be a mercy. "Was I just a job?" he asked, a single tear finally escaping and tracking through the stubble on his jaw. "Was every kiss just a way to make me lower my guard? Did you laugh at me every time I told you I loved you? Tell me it was all a lie. Tell me you hated every second of my touch because I can't live with the thought that you loved me and still did this." Elena's hand trembled. The professional mask she had spent years perfecting began to crumble. Her breath hitched, a broken, jagged sound that mirrored his own. She didn't lower the gun, but she didn't pull the trigger either. She stood there in the wreckage of their trust, trapped between the person she was trained to be and the person she had become in his arms. "It was supposed to be a job," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "It was only ever supposed to be a job, but I forgot. I forgot how to stay outside of you, Enzo." They stood there in the gray morning light, 2 enemies who had accidentally become soulmates, realizing that the truth hadn't set them free. It had only ensured that whoever walked out of that room would be leaving their heart behind. Stay tuned for part 2 of this story, where they have to choose either their past lives or each other. If you are yet to subscribe to this channel, you will be missing out on our next story. Hit the subscribe button now. Thank you for watching.